The flames licked hungrily at the dried bundles of herbs as the mob cheered, their faces twisted with righteous fury in the firelight. Margaret Foster watched from her cabin window as 3 years of carefully gathered medicinal plants turned to ash in the town square of Millbrook, Texas. Behind her, old Samuel Crawford lay dying on her kitchen table, his breath rattling in his chest while the town that had once begged for her healing now demanded her destruction. In 12 hours, everything she had built would crumble, but she couldn't know that salvation would come riding in on a weathered horse, spoken by a cowboy whose scars told stories of wisdom earned through suffering. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Rose Foster had arrived in Millbrook, Texas in the spring of 1885 with nothing but a worn leather satchel filled with seeds, a dog-eared copy of Culpepper's Complete Herbal, and a determination forged from necessity. The small farming community of 300 souls, nestled in the rolling hills between Austin and San Antonio, had seemed like the perfect place to disappear from the memories that haunted her back in Virginia. Here, surrounded by endless prairies and the promise of fresh starts, she could practice the healing arts her grandmother had taught her without the whispered conversations and pointed fingers that had followed her east. The cottage she rented from Ezra Mitchell sat at the edge of town, a modest structure with whitewashed walls and a generous plot of land that caught the morning sun just right. Margaret had spent her first months transforming the barren yard into something that would have made her grandmother proud. Neat rows of lavender and chamomile bordered the front path, while the back garden bloomed with echinacea, willowbark saplings, and dozens of other medicinal plants she'd cultivated from the seeds carried in her satchel. Her grandmother, Rosalie Whitmore, had been what polite Virginia society called an herb woman, and what less charitable tongues labeled something darker. But Margaret had seen the miracles. Her grandmother's gentle hands could work with nothing more than dried leaves, roots, and knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that healing came from the earth itself. When a fever broke after a tea made from elderflower and willow bark, when infected wounds healed clean after applications of calendula and comfrey, when colicky babies finally slept after fennel water, Margaret knew she was witnessing something far more powerful than superstition. The people of Millbrook had welcomed her healing knowledge with grateful relief. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the town's only physician, was a competent man in his 60s, whose formal medical training served him well for broken bones and obvious ailments, but who often found himself at a loss when faced with the mysterious fevers, persistent coughs, and chronic pains that plagued frontier life. Margaret's arrival provided a complement to his practice rather than competition, and their relationship had developed into one of mutual respect and occasional collaboration. When little Emma Patterson had nearly died from whooping cough the previous winter, it was Margaret's syrup made from wild cherry bark and honey that had finally quieted the terrible spasms that kept the child awake for weeks. Dr. Blackwood himself had admitted he was at a loss, having exhausted his supply of conventional treatments. The grateful tears in Emma's mother's eyes when her daughter finally slept peacefully had confirmed for Margaret that she'd found her calling and her place. The town's acceptance hadn't come immediately or without effort. Margaret understood that earning trust in a close-knit community required patience, consistency, and results. She'd started small, offering to treat minor ailments and injuries that people hesitated to bother the doctor with. A poultice for Mrs. Henderson's arthritis that reduced her pain enough to let her sleep through the night. A digestive tea for the blacksmith's chronic stomach, troubles that let him work without constant discomfort. Salves for the children's cuts and scrapes that healed without infection. Word spread the way it always did in small towns, from kitchen to kitchen, woman to woman, carried on the wings of relief and gratitude. Margaret's reputation grew not through self-promotion, but through the quiet testimony of neighbours whose suffering had been eased by her gentle remedies. She never charged more than people could afford, often accepting payment in vegetables from family gardens, preserved foods, or simple favours. The elderly widow, Sarah Crane, paid for her rheumatism treatments by helping Margaret identify wild plants in the surrounding countryside, sharing knowledge of local flora that proved invaluable. Margaret's days followed a rhythm that connected her to both the natural world and the human community she served. She rose before dawn to tend her garden, checking the progress of seedlings, harvesting mature plants at their peak potency, and preparing the various tinctures, dried herbs, and salves that comprised her medicine chest. The morning hours were spent processing the previous day's harvest, grinding roots, straining tinctures, and organizing her supplies with the methodical care her grandmother had instilled in her. By mid-morning, she would make her rounds through town, checking on patients with chronic conditions, delivering remedies, and teaching families how to prepare simple treatments themselves. She carried her grandmother's worn leather bag, its compartments carefully organized with small bottles, packets of dried herbs, and basic instruments for examining patients. The bag had traveled with her from Virginia, a tangible connection to the woman who had shaped her understanding of healing as both art and sacred responsibility. The afternoons often brought visitors to her cottage, people seeking treatment for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Margaret had learned to listen not just to physical symptoms, but to the stories people told about their lives, understanding that healing often required addressing emotional wounds alongside bodily ones. The lonely farmer's wife, whose mysterious fatigue disappeared after Margaret prescribed not just iron-rich nettle tea, but regular visits with other women in town. The young man whose persistent nightmares finally faded after he found the courage to speak about his experiences in the recent Apache conflicts, aided by Margaret's calming valerian root preparations and her willingness to listen without judgment. Her cottage had become an informal gathering place for the town's women, particularly those dealing with what Dr. Blackwood's medical training left him uncomfortable addressing. Margaret's knowledge of women's health issues, learned from her grandmother's careful teaching and her own discreet study, filled a crucial gap in the community's medical care. She helped young brides prepare for marriage, supported women through difficult pregnancies, and eased the transition through the changing years with herbs and wisdom that male physicians rarely possessed. Margaret's relationship with the local church reflected the delicate balance she maintained between her healing practice and community acceptance. Reverend Joshua Pemberton, a thoughtful man in his 40s who had served Millbrook's Methodist congregation for nearly a decade, had initially approached her work with cautious curiosity rather than immediate condemnation. Their first real conversation had occurred when his own wife, Hannah, had come to Margaret seeking help for severe monthly pains that left her bedridden for days at a time. Hannah Pemberton's relief after Margaret's treatments with willow bark and raspberry leaf preparations had impressed her husband enough that he began to see Margaret's work as potentially complementary to rather than competitive with spiritual healing. They had developed what Margaret considered a respectful coexistence, with Reverend Pemberton acknowledging that God worked through many channels, including the healing properties he had placed in plants. This theological flexibility, however, was not shared by all members of the congregation. Margaret was aware of the undercurrent of suspicion that surrounded any woman who possessed knowledge that seemed to venture beyond conventional domestic skills. The line between healing and witchcraft had been drawn and redrawn throughout history, often depending more on politics and prejudice than on actual practices. Her grandmother had warned her about this, teaching her to be mindful of how she presented her work and to whom. The seasonal cycles of her practice connected Margaret to the rhythms of the land in ways that deepened her appreciation for the natural world. Spring brought the delicate work of gathering early shoots and leaves when plants concentrated their energy in tender new growth. She would walk for miles in the pre-dawn hours, collecting violet leaves for their anti-inflammatory properties, dandelion greens for liver support, and the young leaves of plantain that served as nature's bandage for wounds and insect bites. Summer was the time of flowers and the full expression of plant medicine. Margaret's garden exploded with colour and fragrance as calendula, echinacea, and dozens of other medicinal plants reached their peak. She spent long days harvesting, drying, and processing the abundance, working to preserve the plant's healing properties for the leaner months ahead. Her cottage filled with the scents of drying herbs hanging in carefully arranged bundles from the rafters, creating an aromatic pharmacy that visitors found both comforting and slightly mysterious. Autumn brought the root harvest, the time for digging deep into the earth to gather the concentrated medicine stored in underground plant parts, echinacea roots for immune support, burdock for purifying the blood, and marshmallow root for soothing inflamed tissues. This was intensive physical work that left Margaret's hands stained with earth and her body aching, but she found deep satisfaction in the connection to the land that had sustained her grandmother and countless generations of healing women before. Her winter was the season of preparation and study, when Margaret would review her notes from the year's treatments, comparing results and refining her understanding of which combinations worked best for different conditions. She would spend hours by lamplight, reading and rereading her grandmother's journals, cross-referencing them with the formal herbal texts she had managed to acquire. The cottage became a laboratory where theory met practice, where traditional knowledge was tested against careful observation and documented results. Margaret's detailed record-keeping reflected both her scientific mindset and her understanding that documentation would be crucial if her work was ever questioned. She maintained careful notes on every patient she treated, recording symptoms, remedies used, dosages, and outcomes. These records filled several leather-bound journals that she stored in a locked box beneath her bed, understanding instinctively that such detailed knowledge of the community's ailments and treatments could be viewed with suspicion by those inclined to see malevolent intent in women's wisdom. The social dynamics of Millbrook provided Margaret with both support and subtle challenges. The town's established families, many of whom had arrived in the early days of Texas statehood, maintained a complex web of relationships and hierarchies that any newcomer needed to navigate carefully. Margaret's acceptance had been facilitated by her treatment of several prominent family members, but she remained aware that her position in the community was contingent on continued success and the absence of any dramatic failures that could be blamed on her methods. The economic depression that had gripped the region following the bank failures of 1884 had created additional stress for everyone in Millbrook. Crop failures, livestock diseases, and the general uncertainty about the future had left many families struggling financially and emotionally. Margaret found herself treating not just physical ailments, but the anxiety and despair that accompanied economic hardship. Her willingness to accept whatever payment people could manage, or sometimes no payment at all, had endeared her to families who might otherwise have gone without any medical care. Dr. Blackwood's endorsement of her work had been crucial to her acceptance, but Margaret understood that even his support had limits. The medical establishment, such as it was on the frontier, remained dominated by men who had received formal training in established institutions. Women's knowledge, no matter how effective, was often viewed as supplementary at best and dangerous at worst. Margaret had learned to present her work as supportive of, rather than competitive, with conventional medicine, always deferring to Dr. Blackwood's authority, while quietly achieving results that sometimes surpassed his own. The political climate of Texas in the 1880s added another layer of complexity to Margaret's situation. The state was still finding its identity following Reconstruction, and traditional gender roles were being both reinforced and quietly challenged by the practical necessities of frontier life. Women who stepped beyond conventional boundaries had to be particularly careful about how they presented themselves and their work. Margaret had observed how other strong women in the community navigated these expectations, learning from their strategies while developing her own approach to maintaining independence while avoiding direct confrontation with social norms. As the summer of 1887 approached, Margaret reflected on the life she had built in Millbrook with quiet satisfaction. Her garden was more productive than ever, her reputation for healing was solid, and she had found a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded her in Virginia. The cottage had become truly her own, filled with the tools of her trade and the accumulated wisdom of 3 years of frontier practice. The community's trust in her abilities had grown to the point where people sought her help not just for physical ailments, but for guidance on a wide range of domestic and personal matters. Young mothers asked her advice on child-rearing. Struggling families sought her counsel on managing scarce resources, and even some of the town's men had begun to seek her help for conditions they were too embarrassed to discuss with Dr. Blackwood. Margaret's personal life had settled into a rhythm of solitary contentment punctuated by meaningful connections with the people she served. She had deliberately avoided romantic entanglements, understanding that her independence and focus on her healing work might be compromised by the expectations that would come with marriage. The frontier offered unusual opportunities for women to live independently, and Margaret was determined to make the most of those opportunities while they lasted. Her correspondence with former friends and family back in Virginia had gradually dwindled, partly due to the practical difficulties of frontier mail service, and partly because her new life felt so completely removed from her previous existence that the old connections seemed increasingly irrelevant. She was becoming, she realized, a truly Western woman, shaped by the demands and opportunities of frontier life in ways that would have been impossible in the more constrained social environment of the East. The knowledge that sustained her came not just from books and formal training, but from the daily observation of the natural world around her. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when plants were ready for harvest, how weather patterns affected the potency of medicinal herbs, and which combinations of treatments worked best for the specific conditions created by frontier life. This practical wisdom, built through careful observation and documented experience, gave her confidence in her abilities and her place in the community. As Margaret stood in her garden on a warm June evening in 1887, watching the last light of day fade behind the rolling hills that surrounded Millbrook, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had brought her to this place. The healing work that had once made her suspect in Virginia society had become her strength and identity in Texas. She had found a community that valued her abilities and a landscape that supported her calling, the gentle breeze that stirred her. Herbs carried the scents of chamomile and lavender, plants that her grandmother had first taught her to cultivate. In that moment, Margaret felt the connection across generations of healing women, each passing knowledge to the next, each finding ways to serve their communities despite the challenges and suspicions that such work could generate. She was part of something larger than herself, a tradition of compassion and practical wisdom that had sustained communities through countless hardships. Margaret Foster had no way of knowing that within weeks, this carefully constructed life would be tested in ways she had never imagined, that forces beyond her control were already moving to challenge everything she had built in Millbrook. But on that peaceful evening, surrounded by the plants that were both her livelihood and her passion, she felt only the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to her deepest values and the promise of continued service to the community that had become her home. The trouble began with the Morrison children on a sweltering July morning when the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees before the church bells chimed 8 o'clock. Margaret was in her garden, carefully harvesting calendula petals for a healing salve, when young Timothy Patterson came running down the dusty road, his face flushed with more than just the heat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miss Foster, he called out, stumbling through her garden gate. Ma says you need to come quick. The Morrison young ones, they're all sick something fierce, and Mrs. Morrison's beside herself with worry. Margaret immediately set down her gathering basket and reached for the leather medical bag that never strayed far from her side. The Morrison family lived in a ramshackle homestead about 2 miles outside town, where Henry Morrison struggled to make a living from 40 acres of stubborn soil and a small herd of cattle that seemed determined to wander into every possible form of trouble. "What kind of sick, Timothy?" Margaret asked as she quickly selected additional supplies from her cottage. "Fever? Stomach troubles?" "Don't rightly know, ma'am," the boy replied, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Just that all 4 of them took ill overnight, and Mrs. Morrison sent me to fetch you 'cause Dr. Blackwood's gone to Austin for that medical conference." Margaret's mind immediately began cataloguing possibilities as she secured her supplies and saddled her mare, Juniper. 4 children falling ill simultaneously suggested either food poisoning, contaminated water, or some form of contagious disease. Each possibility required different approaches, and with Dr. Blackwood away at the state medical conference, she would be the only trained healer available to assess the situation. The ride to the Morrison homestead took nearly an hour across the rough terrain, with Timothy leading the way on his father's old mule. As they approached the modest wooden house, Margaret could see Rebecca Morrison pacing frantically on the front porch, her usually neat appearance disheveled with worry. The silence that should have been filled with children's voices was ominous in itself. "Oh, thank the Lord you've come," Rebecca called out as Margaret dismounted. "I don't know what to do. They were fine when they went to bed last night, but this morning—" Her voice broke with exhaustion and fear. Margaret followed Rebecca into the small house where the 4 Morrison children lay in various states of distress. 8-year-old Mary was curled in a tight ball, clutching her stomach and whimpering softly. 6-year-old James alternated between shivering and burning with fever. 4-year-old Susan seemed barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. 2-year-old baby Samuel was the most alarming sight, his tiny body racked with violent convulsions that left his mother helpless and terrified. "When did the symptoms start?" Margaret asked, immediately moving to examine baby Samuel while mentally calculating dosages for emergency treatments. "About midnight," Rebecca replied, wringing her hands. "Mary woke up first, crying about her belly hurting something awful. Then James started burning up with fever, and by dawn they were all in terrible shape. Samuel's been having those fits for the past hour." Margaret's trained eye quickly assessed the children's conditions. The combination of gastrointestinal distress, high fever, and convulsions pointed towards severe poisoning rather than a typical childhood illness. She began her examination with baby Samuel, whose convulsions were the most immediately life-threatening symptom. "Rebecca, I need you to boil water immediately," Margaret instructed, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "And bring me all the milk you have in the house. What did the children eat yesterday?" "Same as always," Rebecca replied, hurrying to light the stove. "Cornbread and milk for breakfast, leftover stew for dinner. Nothing different from what Henry E. and I ate, and we're fine." Margaret continued her examination, noting the children's dilated pupils, rapid heartbeats, and the distinctive bitter smell on their breath. The symptoms were beginning to form a pattern that filled her with dread. She had seen these signs before, in her grandmother's notes about accidental poisonings from common plants that could be mistaken for edible varieties. "Rebecca, Think carefully, Margaret said, as she prepared a charcoal mixture to help absorb whatever toxin was affecting the children. Did the children go berry picking yesterday, or play anywhere they might have eaten wild plants? Rebecca paused in her water boiling, her face growing pale. They went down to the creek in the afternoon. Mary mentioned finding some pretty berries, but I told them not to eat anything they found. Her voice trailed off as the implication hit her. Margaret nodded grimly. Pokeweed berries, attractive purple clusters that looked similar to elderberries, grew wild throughout the Texas hill country. Children were often drawn to their appealing appearance, unaware that the entire pokeweed plant contained powerful toxins that could prove fatal, especially to small bodies. Working quickly but methodically, Margaret began administering treatments designed to counteract the poisoning. She gave each child activated charcoal mixed with water to absorb remaining toxins in their digestive systems. For baby Samuel's convulsions, she prepared a carefully measured dose of valerian root tincture, knowing that the margin for error with such a small child was terrifyingly narrow. The older children received milk to help protect their stomachs and dilute the toxins, followed by gentle herbal preparations designed to support their liver and kidney function as their bodies worked to eliminate the poison. Margaret's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was racing through everything her grandmother had taught her about treating plant poisonings. As the morning progressed, Margaret maintained a constant vigil over the children, monitoring their breathing, adjusting treatments, and providing what comfort she could to both the children and their increasingly frantic mother. The baby's convulsions gradually subsided under the influence of the valerian, but his condition remained critical. "Will they live?" Rebecca asked in a whisper during a brief moment when all 4 children seemed to be resting more peacefully. "I believe so," Margaret replied carefully, "but the next 24 hours will be crucial. The treatments should help their bodies eliminate the poison, but we need to watch for any changes." Word of the Morrison children's illness spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town networks could achieve. By late afternoon, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the homestead, bringing food, offering prayers, and seeking updates on the children's condition. Margaret found herself not only treating patients, but also managing the well-meaning but sometimes overwhelming attention of concerned neighbors. Among the visitors was Constable William Hughes, a stern man in his 50s whose approach to law enforcement reflected his belief that most problems resulted from moral failings rather than mere misfortune. Hughes had never been entirely comfortable with Margaret's healing practice, viewing her methods with the suspicion he reserved for anything that didn't fit neatly into his understanding of proper Christian behavior. "Heard there's been some kind of poisoning out here," Hughes announced as he entered the Morrison house without waiting for an invitation. "Need to know exactly what happened and what's being done about it." Margaret looked up from where she was, giving Mary a sip of ginger tea to settle her stomach. "The children accidentally consumed pokeweed berries while playing near the creek. I'm treating them for plant poisoning." Hughes's expression darkened as he absorbed this information. "Pokeweed, you say? And how exactly do you know it was pokeweed? Did you see them eat it?" "The symptoms are consistent with pokeweed poisoning," Margaret explained patiently. "Gastrointestinal distress, fever, convulsions in the youngest child. The timing and presentation make it the most likely diagnosis." "Most likely according to what authority?" Hughes pressed. "Dr. Blackwood isn't here to confirm your diagnosis. For all we know, these children might be suffering from some contagious disease that you're not equipped to identify." Rebecca Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, stepped forward. "Constable Hughes, Miss Foster has been treating my children all day. Samuel's convulsions have stopped, and the others are resting better than they have since this started." I trust her judgment completely. Hughes's skepticism remained evident. "That's all well and good, Mrs. Morrison, but I have a responsibility to protect this community. If there's some kind of epidemic starting, we need proper medical authority to assess the situation." Margaret felt a familiar tension building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced back in Virginia when her healing work had begun to attract unwanted attention from authorities who viewed women's medical knowledge with inherent suspicion. She chose her words carefully, knowing that how she handled this moment could have far-reaching consequences. "Constable, I'm happy to document my observations and treatments for Dr. Blackwood's review when he returns," she offered. "I've maintained detailed records of the children's symptoms and responses to treatment. Any qualified physician would be able to assess the accuracy of my diagnosis based on that documentation." Hughes seemed momentarily appeased by this suggestion, but his expression remained troubled. "See that you do, and I'll be making my own report about this incident. Can't have people taking medical matters into their own hands without proper oversight." After Hughes departed, Margaret continued her care of the Morrison children through the evening and into the night. She remained at the homestead, monitoring their progress and adjusting treatments as needed. By dawn, all 4 children showed marked improvement. Baby Samuel was alert and responsive, his fever broken and his color returning to normal. The older children were sitting up and taking small amounts of food, their recovery progressing better than Margaret had dared hope. The successful treatment of the Morrison children should have been a triumph, but Margaret found herself uneasy about Constable Hughes's reaction and the implications of his promised report. She had seen how quickly suspicion could spread in small communities, how success could be reinterpreted as something sinister by those predisposed to doubt women's capabilities. Dr. Blackwood returned from Austin 3 days later to find the Morrison children fully recovered and the town buzzing with talk about Margaret's dramatic overnight treatment. His examination of the children confirmed Margaret's diagnosis and endorsed her treatment methods, but she noticed a new reserve in his manner that hadn't been there before his departure. "Your documentation is quite thorough," Dr. Blackwood acknowledged, as he reviewed Margaret's detailed notes about the poisoning incident. "The diagnosis appears correct, and the treatments were appropriate. However, I should mention that there's been some discussion in Austin about the regulation of medical practice in rural areas." Margaret felt her heart sink at these words. "What kind of discussion?" "The State Medical Board is considering new requirements for anyone providing medical treatment," Dr. Blackwood explained uncomfortably. "Formal licensing, documentation of training, that sort of thing. It's meant to protect the public from unqualified practitioners." The implications were clear. Margaret's grandmother's training, extensive though it was, had never been formally recognized by any official medical institution. Her success in treating patients would mean nothing if legal requirements demanded credentials she couldn't obtain. "When would such requirements take effect?" Margaret asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Nothing has been decided yet," Dr. Blackwood replied. "These are just preliminary discussions. But given recent incidents like the Morrison children's poisoning, there's growing pressure to ensure that only properly qualified individuals are providing medical care." Margaret understood the subtext, the very success that had earned her acceptance in Millbrook was now being used as evidence of the need for greater regulation. The fact that she had correctly diagnosed and successfully treated a potentially fatal poisoning was somehow being twisted into an argument that her work was dangerous and uncontrolled. That evening, as Margaret tended her garden in the fading light, she reflected on how quickly circumstances could change. 3 days ago, she had been a respected healer whose services were valued by the community. Now, she found herself facing the possibility that her life's work might be deemed illegal by authorities who had never witnessed her methods or results. The plants around her seemed to whisper warnings in the evening breeze, the same knowledge that had saved the Morrison children could potentially be used against her if the wrong people chose to interpret her success as evidence of dangerous practices beyond legitimate medical authority. Margaret had learned from her grandmother that healing women throughout history had walked this narrow line between acceptance and persecution, their very effectiveness sometimes becoming the evidence used to condemn them. As she gathered the last of the day's harvest, Margaret's hands trembled slightly, despite her efforts to remain calm. The Morrison children's recovery had been a medical triumph, but it had also marked her as someone whose abilities challenged conventional understanding of what was possible and proper. In a world where women's knowledge was often viewed with suspicion, dramatic success could be as dangerous as dramatic failure. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where a lone rider was approaching her cottage at a leisurely pace. Even in the gathering dusk, Margaret could see that this was no local resident. The man sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, and his weathered appearance suggested he had traveled considerable distances across difficult terrain. As the rider drew closer, Margaret could make out more details. He appeared to be in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and beard. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, designed for function rather than appearance, but his horse was a magnificent animal that spoke of both good judgment and significant resources. The stranger reined in at Margaret's gate and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Evening, ma'am. I'm looking for Margaret Foster, the herb woman. Been told she might be able to help with a medical problem." "I'm Margaret Foster," she replied cautiously, aware that unknown visitors could bring either opportunity or trouble. "What kind of help are you seeking?" The man dismounted with fluid grace, despite his apparent age, approaching the gate with respectful but confident bearing. "Name's Clayton Hartwell, ma'am. I run cattle up north of here, and I've got a situation that regular doctoring hasn't been able to address. Heard tell you might have different approaches that could prove useful." Margaret studied Clayton Hartwell carefully, noting the intelligence in his weathered face and the respect in his manner. There was something about him that suggested both competence and integrity, qualities she had learned to value highly in the frontier environment. "What kind of situation, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked, her professional instincts overriding her personal caution. "Got a ranch hand who's been suffering from what the doc in Austin calls nervous exhaustion. Been getting worse over the past few months, and conventional treatments aren't helping. Man's been with me for 15 years, and I'm not willing to give up on him if there's anything else that might be tried." Margaret found herself intrigued despite her current concerns about official scrutiny. Nervous exhaustion was often a catch-all diagnosis for conditions that conventional medicine couldn't adequately address, and she had seen cases where herbal treatments that supported the nervous system and addressed underlying nutritional deficiencies had produced remarkable improvements. "I'd be willing to assess the situation," Margaret said carefully, "but I should mention that there's currently some question about the legal status of my practice. The state may be implementing new licensing requirements that could affect my ability to treat patients." Clayton Hartwell's expression grew thoughtful. "Legal status, you say? That's an interesting development. Mind if I ask what prompted this official interest in your work?" Margaret briefly explained the Morrison children's poisoning and Constable Hughes's concerns about proper medical authority. As she spoke, she noticed that Clayton listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to gathering and evaluating information quickly and accurately. "So your success in saving those children has somehow created problems for you," Clayton observed when she finished. "That's a peculiar way for authorities to respond to effective healing. It seems that dramatic results can be as threatening as dramatic failures," Margaret replied, "especially when they come from sources that don't fit conventional expectations." Clayton, nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was not entirely surprised by this turn of events. "Ma'am, I've spent most of my life dealing with various kinds of authority, both legitimate and otherwise. One thing I've learned is that people in power often feel threatened by competence that operates outside their control." Margaret found herself curious about this stranger who seemed to understand the complex dynamics surrounding her situation so readily. There was something in his manner that suggested extensive experience with conflict and its resolution, though she couldn't yet determine the source of that experience. "Your ranch hand," she said, returning to the original topic. "How far would I need to travel to assess his condition?" 3 days' ride north, Clayton replied. "I know that's asking a lot, especially given your current circumstances, but I'm prepared to make it worth your while, and I can guarantee your safety during the journey." Margaret weighed the offer carefully. 3 days away from Millbrook would remove her from the growing scrutiny surrounding her practice, and might provide time to consider her options regarding the potential licensing requirements. On the other hand, leaving town at this particular moment might be interpreted as an admission of guilt or an attempt to avoid official oversight. "I'd need to arrange for care of my garden and notify people about my absence," Margaret said finally, "and I'd want to understand more about your ranch hand's condition before committing to the journey." Clayton smiled for the first time since arriving, the expression transforming his weathered face and revealing the warmth beneath his serious demeanor. "Fair enough, ma'am. Would you be willing to discuss the details over coffee? I've been riding since before dawn, and I'd appreciate the hospitality if you're inclined to offer it." Margaret found herself making a decision that felt both natural and momentous. Despite her current troubles, or perhaps because of them, she was drawn to this stranger who seemed to understand both the value of her work and the challenges it created. "Of course, Mr. Hartwell, please come inside." As she led Clayton toward her cottage, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this unexpected visitor represented some kind of turning point in her story. Whether that turning point would lead toward greater difficulties or unexpected opportunities remained to be seen, but she sensed that her carefully constructed life in Millbrook was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The evening air carried the scent of her medicinal plants and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. In a few hours, she would need to make a decision that could determine not just her immediate future, but the direction of her entire life's work. The stranger who had appeared at her gate might be offering either salvation or greater danger, and Margaret realized that her ability to distinguish between the two would be crucial to everything that followed. Margaret's coffee pot had barely finished brewing when Clayton Hartwell began telling her about Thomas Brennan, the ranch hand whose condition had brought him riding 60 miles in search of help that conventional medicine couldn't provide. As Clayton spoke, Margaret found herself drawn into a story that revealed as much about the teller as about the man he was trying to save. Thomas Brennan had come to work for Clayton 15 years earlier, a young man haunted by experiences during the Indian Wars that had left invisible wounds deeper than any physical injury. Clayton had recognized something familiar in Thomas's haunted eyes, having carried his own share of battlefield memories from service in the Confederate cavalry during the war between the states. Tom was the kind of man who could gentle the wildest mustang or track a lost steer across 50 miles of rough country, Clayton explained, accepting the steaming cup Margaret offered. But something inside him started breaking down about 6 months ago. Nightmares got worse, couldn't keep food down, hands started shaking so bad he could barely hold reins. Margaret listened with growing interest, recognizing symptoms she had encountered before in men who had seen too much violence. Her grandmother had taught her that trauma could lodge itself in the body like a physical poison, creating symptoms that traditional medicine often dismissed as weakness or moral failing. "What treatments has he tried?" Margaret asked, settling into her chair across from Clayton. Doc in Austin gave him laudanum for the nightmares, but that just made him worse during the day. Tried bloodletting for what he called nervous fever. Even suggested we send Tom to one of those asylum places. Clayton's expression darkened. Man's been loyal to me for 15 years. I'm not giving up on him because some doctor doesn't know how to help. Margaret appreciated Clayton's loyalty, but she also understood the complexity of treating what physicians were beginning to call neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. The condition often required addressing both physical symptoms and underlying emotional trauma, something that demanded time, patience, and treatments that went beyond conventional medicine's current understanding. "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret said carefully, "I should be honest about what I might be able to offer. Conditions like your friend's often require extended treatment, and there's no guarantee of success. Additionally, my current situation here in Millbrook may complicate my ability to travel." Clayton leaned forward, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup. "Miss Foster, let me tell you something about situations. I've been dealing with difficult circumstances my whole life, from battlefield medicine during the war to range disputes with hostile neighbors. What I've learned is that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Through her window, she could see torches flickering in the darkness, an ominous sight that immediately put her on alert. No good news ever arrived by torchlight after nightfall. Clayton noticed her tension and moved to the window himself, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip. "Expecting visitors, Miss Foster?" "No," Margaret replied, her stomach tightening with apprehension. "And in my experience, groups of men with torches rarely bring good intentions." The rider stopped at Margaret's gate, and she recognized Constable Hughes's voice calling out above the others. "Margaret Foster, come out here. We need to have a discussion about your medical practices and the safety of this community." Margaret took a deep breath, understanding that the moment she had been dreading since the Morrison incident had finally arrived. She glanced at Clayton, who was studying the group outside with the calculating assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "How many?" he asked quietly. "7 or 8, Margaret replied, moving toward the door. "Including Constable Hughes and what looks like several members of the town council." Clayton positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings while remaining out of immediate sight. "I'll be right here if you need assistance." Margaret stepped onto her porch, maintaining her composure despite the intimidating sight of mounted men surrounding her property. In addition to Constable Hughes, she recognized Ezra Mitchell, her landlord, Jeremiah Polk, chairman of the town council, and several other prominent men whose wives had sought her treatment over the past 2 years. "Gentlemen," Margaret said evenly, "it's rather late for a social call. What brings you to my home at this hour?" Constable Hughes dismounted, his expression stern in the torchlight. "We've received disturbing reports about your treatment of the Morrison children, Miss Foster. There are questions about whether your methods constitute proper medical care or something more questionable." Margaret felt anger flare at the implication but kept her voice level. "The Morrison children recovered completely under my care. Dr. Blackwood examined them upon his return and confirmed both my diagnosis and treatment methods." Ezra Mitchell, her landlord, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "That may be so, Miss Foster, but there are other concerns. People are talking about the unusual nature of your remedies, the strange plants you grow, the rituals some claim to have witnessed." "Rituals?" Margaret repeated, genuinely confused. "I grow medicinal plants and prepare herbal treatments, according to traditional methods. There's nothing ritualistic about proper pharmaceutical preparation." Jeremiah Polk leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words taken seriously. "Miss Foster, this community has been built on Christian principles and proper order. We cannot allow practices that might be interpreted as irregular to continue unchecked." Margaret realized that she was facing more than simple medical skepticism. The charges being implied touched on far more serious accusations that could have devastating consequences. In frontier communities, suspicions about witchcraft or other supernatural practices could escalate quickly beyond rational discussion. "Mr. Polk, I'm a trained herbalist providing medical treatment based on established botanical knowledge," Margaret said firmly. "I maintain detailed records of all my treatments, and my methods are documented in recognized medical texts. There's nothing irregular about using plants for healing purposes." Constable Hughes stepped closer to the porch, his hand resting on his gun belt. "The problem, Miss Foster, is that your training isn't recognized by any official authority. You have no license, no formal credentials, no oversight. For all we know, you could be practicing witchcraft and calling it medicine." The word hung in the air like a curse, carrying with it centuries of fear and persecution. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized how quickly her life's work was being twisted into something dark and threatening. "That's a serious accusation, Constable," she replied, working to keep her voice steady. "I hope you have evidence to support such claims." "Evidence is what we're here to discuss," Hughes replied. "We need to search your premises for any materials that might be used for purposes other than legitimate medical treatment." Margaret's mind raced through the contents of her cottage and garden. While everything she possessed had legitimate medical applications, she knew that items like her grandmother's old ritual tools, certain rare herbs, and her detailed journals could easily be misinterpreted by people determined to find evidence of wrongdoing. "Do you have a warrant for such a search?" Margaret asked, hoping that legal procedures might provide some protection. Hughes smiled grimly. "This is Texas, Miss Foster, not some eastern city with fancy lawyers. We have the authority to investigate threats to community safety, and that's exactly what we're doing." At that moment, Clayton Hartwell stepped onto the porch beside Margaret, his presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. The men on horseback shifted nervously as they took in his confident bearing and the gun prominent on his hip. "Evening, gentlemen," Clayton said pleasantly, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. Might I ask what specific laws Miss Foster is accused of violating?" Constable Hughes' expression hardened as he faced this unexpected intervention. "And who might you be, stranger?" "Clayton Hartwell," he replied simply. "I've ridden down from my ranch to consult with Miss Foster about medical treatment for one of my hands. I have to say, I'm surprised to find such a distinguished gathering, questioning the credentials of someone whose reputation for healing extends well beyond this immediate community." Clayton's laugh was dry and humorless. "Irregular practices? Gentlemen, I've seen Miss Foster's reputation reach as far as Austin and San Antonio. Ranchers, farmers, even some military officers have spoken highly of her healing abilities. If that's irregular, it's the kind of irregularity most communities would welcome." Margaret realized that Clayton was revealing knowledge about her reputation that extended far beyond what she had imagined. His words suggested that her work had been discussed and evaluated by people with significant influence, which could either help or hurt her current situation depending on how these local men interpreted such recognition. Constable Hughes stepped back, his hand moving closer to his gun. "Mr. Hartwell, I'll ask you to step aside and let us conduct our business. This woman is suspected of practicing witchcraft under the guise of medicine, and we have the authority to investigate such charges." The word witchcraft, spoken aloud, seemed to electrify the group, transforming what had been a tense discussion into something far more dangerous. Margaret saw hands moving toward weapons and torches, raising higher, creating an atmosphere where rational thought could quickly give way to mob violence. Clayton's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but Margaret could sense the coiled tension in his frame. "Constable, that's a serious accusation that requires serious evidence. Do you have witnesses to actual witchcraft? Physical proof of supernatural practices? Or are you basing these charges on successful medical treatment and community gossip? We have reports of strange rituals, unusual plant preparations, and treatment methods that go beyond normal medical practice," Hughes replied, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Margaret decided that this was the moment to take a stand, regardless of the consequences. Her grandmother had taught her that there came times when healers had to choose between safety and principle, and she recognized that such a moment had arrived. "Gentlemen," she said, stepping forward despite Clayton's protective presence, I'm indeed an herbalist trained in traditional plant medicine. Every treatment I provide is based on documented botanical knowledge, passed down through generations of healers. If you consider that witchcraft, then you're condemning centuries of medical tradition that has saved countless lives." She paused, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "I have treated many of your wives and children with herbs and methods you now claim to find suspicious. Were their recoveries the result of witchcraft? Should they fear that their improved health came from supernatural sources?" Ezra Mitchell, her landlord, looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Miss Foster, nobody's questioning your good intentions, but there are concerns about the source of your knowledge and methods." "The source of my knowledge is my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother, reaching back generations of women who understood that plants contain natural medicines," Margaret replied firmly. "The same knowledge that allows farmers to grow crops and ranchers to graze cattle. If you condemn one as witchcraft, where does such logic end?" Clayton nodded approvingly at Margaret's defense. "Miss Foster raises an excellent point. Are you, gentlemen, prepared to declare that all traditional knowledge is supernatural? That would put most of your wives' cooking and household remedies under suspicion as well." The group of men began to show signs of uncertainty as the implications of their accusations became clearer. Margaret could see doubt creeping into some faces, though Constable Hughes remained steadfast in his suspicion. "The problem," Hughes insisted, "is that Miss Foster's methods go beyond simple household remedies. There are reports of strange ceremonies, unusual preparations, and results that seem too successful to be entirely natural." Margaret felt a flash of anger at the circular logic that made her competence evidence of wrongdoing. "Constable Hughes, are you suggesting that effective healing is proof of supernatural intervention? Should doctors be less successful to avoid suspicion? I'm suggesting that some things are too convenient to be entirely natural," Hughes replied. "And when people start talking about witchcraft, we have to take such concerns seriously." Clayton stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Constable, I've served in cavalry units, run cattle operations, and dealt with everything from hostile Indians to rustlers. I've learned to distinguish between real threats and imaginary ones. What I see here is a community turning against someone whose only crime is being more competent than they expected." The tension continued to build as Margaret realized that this confrontation was approaching a point where violence might become inevitable. The men facing her represented entrenched authority and community pressure, while Clayton's support, though welcome, came from an outsider whose intervention might be seen as further evidence of her suspicious associations. "Miss Foster, Jeremiah," Polk said finally, "we're prepared to be reasonable about this situation. If you'll submit to a proper investigation of your methods and materials, agree to practice only under appropriate supervision, and perhaps consider relocating to somewhere more suitable for your particular approach to medicine, we can resolve this matter without further difficulty. Margaret understood that this was an ultimatum disguised as a reasonable compromise. They were offering her the choice between surrendering her independence or facing escalating persecution that could destroy not just her practice, but potentially her life. She looked at Clayton, seeing in his weathered face both support and understanding of the stakes involved. His slight nod conveyed confidence in whatever decision she made, but also acknowledgement that the choice was ultimately hers alone. Margaret turned back to face the mounted men, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concerns about proper medical practice. However, I cannot agree to supervision by people who consider successful healing evidence of supernatural activity. If my methods and results are insufficient proof of legitimacy, then no amount of supervision will satisfy your concerns." Constable Hughes's expression hardened. "Miss Foster, you're making a serious mistake. This community has been patient with your irregular practices, but that patience has limits. As does my willingness to practice medicine under the supervision of people who don't understand it," Margaret replied. "I've committed no crimes, harmed no patients, and violated no legitimate laws. If you wish to change that status, you'll need to provide actual evidence rather than community gossip and suspicion." Clayton moved closer to Margaret, his presence a clear statement of support and protection. "Constable, Miss Foster has made her position clear. Unless you have specific legal charges based on actual evidence, I suggest this discussion has reached its conclusion." The standoff continued for several tense moments as Hughes weighed his options. Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes, balancing his desire to assert authority against the potential consequences of pushing the confrontation toward violence with an armed stranger of unknown capabilities standing beside his target. Finally, Hughes remounted his horse, his expression promising that this was far from over. "Miss Foster, you've made your choice. Don't expect this community to overlook the consequences of your stubbornness." As the group of men rode away, their torches disappearing into the darkness, Margaret felt both relief and dread. She had stood her ground and maintained her principles, but she had also made powerful enemies who would not easily forget or forgive her defiance. Clayton watched the riders disappear before turning to Margaret. "Well, Miss Foster, I'd say you've definitely reached a decision point. The question now is what comes next." Margaret looked at her cottage, her garden, and the life she had built over 3 years in Millbrook. Everything felt suddenly fragile and uncertain, as if the confrontation had revealed how tenuous her place in the community had always been. "Mr. Hartwell," she said quietly, "I believe I'm ready to hear more about your ranch hand's condition. It seems my options in Millbrook may be more limited than I thought." Clayton smiled grimly. "Ma'am, I suspect that what just happened here is going to make your decision easier than you might have expected. Sometimes circumstances force choices we might not make otherwise." As they returned to the cottage, Margaret realized that her carefully constructed life was indeed crumbling, but perhaps something new and unexpected was being offered in its place. The question was whether she had the courage to embrace an uncertain future in place of a present that was rapidly becoming untenable. The night air carried the scent of her medicinal plants and the distant sound of the men's departure. But Margaret sensed that by morning everything would be different. The confrontation had forced her to choose between principle and safety, and she had chosen principle. Now she would discover what that choice would cost and what it might ultimately provide. Dawn broke over Millbrook with an ominous crimson sky that old-timers called blood on the horizon, and Margaret woke to discover that Constable Hughes had wasted no time in escalating his campaign against her. Smoke was rising from the direction of town, and even before she dressed and stepped. Outside, she could smell the acrid scent of burning vegetation carried on the morning wind. Clayton Hartwell had slept in her barn, his bedroll spread in the loft, where he could keep watch over the approaches to her property. He emerged as Margaret stepped onto her porch, his expression grim as he studied the distant smoke. "They're burning something in the town square," he observed, shading his eyes against the morning sun. "Want to bet it's not just regular trash?" Margaret's heart sank as she realized what the smoke likely represented. During the night, she had heard horses moving around her property, and now she understood their purpose. "My herbs," she said quietly. "They must have taken bundles from my drying shed while we were dealing with the confrontation." The violation felt deeply personal, like watching years of careful work and accumulated knowledge go up in flames. Each bundle represented not just medicinal preparations, but connections to her grandmother's teaching and her own growing understanding of frontier healing practices. Young Timothy Patterson came running up the road again, his face streaked with tears and his voice breaking with emotion. "Miss Foster, they're saying terrible things about you in town. Constable Hughes has been talking all night about witchcraft and devil worship, and they're burning your medicines in the square." Margaret knelt down to Timothy's level, her heart breaking for the boy's distress. Over the past 2 years, she had treated his recurring lung troubles with herbal preparations that had allowed him to breathe freely for the first time in his young life. "Timothy, what exactly are they saying?" she asked gently, though she dreaded the answer. "That you poisoned the Morrison children on purpose to make yourself look good when you cured them," Timothy stammered. "That you made a pact with the devil to gain supernatural healing powers. That you've been casting spells on people to make them trust you." Clayton's expression darkened as he listened to the boy's report. "Sounds like Constable Hughes spent the night spinning quite a tale. Nothing like a good story to turn a community against someone who's inconveniently competent." Margaret stood slowly, processing the implications of these accusations. The charge that she had deliberately poisoned children was not just professionally damaging, but potentially criminal. If such allegations gained traction, she could face legal prosecution that would destroy not just her practice, but potentially her freedom or even her life. "Timothy," she said carefully, "who else is speaking against me? Is it just Constable Hughes, or have others joined his accusations?" The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve before answering. "Well, Mrs. Abernathy has been telling folks that her arthritis got worse after you treated it, which proves you cursed her. And Mr. Polk says you've been gathering information about people's private affairs through your medical examinations to use against them later." Margaret felt a familiar pattern emerging, one her grandmother had warned her about. When communities turned against healing women, individual grievances and fears quickly coalesced into larger narratives of supernatural threat. Mrs. Abernathy's arthritis had indeed worsened recently, but that was due to cold weather and her age, not any failure of treatment. The suggestion that medical examinations were actually intelligence gathering was particularly insidious, as it cast every interaction in a sinister light. "Is anyone speaking in my defense?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. The answer, Timothy's expression grew even more troubled. "Dr. Blackwood tried to defend your treatment of the Morrison children, but they shouted him down. Said he was either fooled by your supernatural tricks or maybe involved himself. Mrs. Morrison stood up for you too, but they wouldn't listen to her either." Clayton placed a protective hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Sounds like the reasonable voices are being drowned out by the hysterical ones. That's usually how these things work, when fear takes hold of a community." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, but this time it was Dr. Blackwood himself, riding alone and looking haggard. He dismounted quickly and approached Margaret with obvious concern. "Margaret, thank God you're safe," he said breathlessly. I tried to reason with them last night, but Hughes whipped them into a frenzy. They're talking about formal charges of witchcraft and poisoning children. Formal charges. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. On what evidence? Dr. Blackwood shook his head in frustration. Evidence seems to be a secondary consideration at this point. Hughes claims that your unusual success rate is proof of supernatural assistance, and he's found several people willing to testify that their conditions worsened after your treatment. Margaret realized that she was facing the classic trap that had ensnared healing women throughout history. Success was interpreted as evidence of supernatural assistance, while any failures were viewed as proof of malevolent intent. No amount of medical knowledge or documented results could defend against accusations that transformed competence into evidence of guilt. Doctor, what would you advise? Margaret asked, valuing his medical opinion despite the deteriorating situation. Honestly, I'd advise leaving town immediately, Dr. Blackwood replied without hesitation. I've seen what happens when communities convince themselves that someone is practicing witchcraft. Rational argument becomes impossible, and mob justice often follows quickly behind official accusations. Clayton nodded agreement. The doctor's right, Miss Foster. Once communities reach this point, staying becomes dangerous for everyone involved. Sometimes tactical withdrawal is the wisest course of action. Margaret looked around at her cottage, her garden, and the life she had built in Millbrook. 3 years of careful work, patient relationship building, and gradual acceptance were being destroyed by fear and ignorance. Yet she also understood that trying to fight these accusations in the current atmosphere would likely result in her destruction rather than vindication. How long do I have? She asked Dr. Blackwood. Hughes is organizing a formal hearing for this afternoon, he replied, grimly. He's calling it a community safety investigation, but it's really a trial. If you're here when it begins, you'll be arrested and held pending the outcome. Margaret made her decision with the clarity that often comes during crisis moments. Dr. Blackwood, I'll need to prepare medical supplies for travel. Clayton, how soon can we leave for your ranch? Within the hour, Clayton replied immediately. I've already saddled your horse and loaded supplies. Sometimes preparation pays off when circumstances change quickly. As Margaret gathered her most essential belongings, she was struck by how few possessions really mattered when life reduced itself to fundamental survival. Her grandmother's medical journals, her most crucial herbal preparations, and the basic tools of her trade fit into 2 saddlebags. Everything else she had accumulated in Millbrook would have to be abandoned. Dr. Blackwood helped her select the most important medical texts and supplies, while Clayton kept watch from the porch. Margaret, I want you to know that I'll continue to defend your methods and results, the doctor said as they worked. This hysteria will eventually pass, and when it does, the community will remember who provided real healing when it was needed. Thank you, Doctor, Margaret replied, touched by his loyalty despite the personal risk it represented. Please continue. Caring for the people I won't be able to help. Some of them will need ongoing treatment that only understanding of their conditions can provide. As they finished loading Margaret's essential belongings, young Timothy Patterson appeared again, this time accompanied by his mother, Sarah. Both looked frightened, but determined as they approached the cottage. Miss Foster, Sarah Patterson said urgently, I had to come warn you. They're planning to search your house after the hearing this afternoon, looking for evidence of witchcraft. But more importantly, my Timothy wanted to give you something before you left. The boy stepped forward shyly, holding out a small cloth bundle. It's money, Miss Foster. From families you've helped who don't dare speak up now. They wanted you to have it for your travels. Margaret accepted the bundle with tears in her eyes, understanding the courage it had taken for these families to contribute to her escape when doing so could mark them as sympathizers with an accused witch. The weight of the coins represented not just financial support, but emotional validation of her work from people who had experienced its benefits firsthand. Timothy, please tell those families that their kindness means more to me than they can. No, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion, and tell them to be careful. Sometimes helping the accused can bring suspicion on the helpers. Sarah Patterson nodded grimly. We understand the risks, Miss Foster, but we also understand what you've done for our children and our community. Some of us won't forget, no matter what lies are being spread. Clayton approached, leading Margaret's saddled horse and his own mount. Miss Foster, if we're going to avoid the afternoon dramatics, we need to leave now. The longer we wait, the more likely we are to encounter organized pursuit. Margaret took one last look at her cottage and garden, memorizing details she might never see again. The morning sun illuminated her medicinal plants in full summer glory, a living testament to the healing knowledge that was now being branded as supernatural evil. She touched the silver locket containing her grandmother's picture that she wore around her neck, drawing strength from the connection to generations of healing women who had faced similar challenges. I'm ready, she said simply, accepting Clayton's help mounting her mare. As they rode away from Millbrook, Margaret could see smoke still rising from the town square, where her carefully prepared medicines continued to burn. Behind them, Dr. Blackwood and the Pattersons watched their departure with obvious sadness, understanding that the community was losing something valuable that might never be replaced. The road north toward Clayton's ranch stretched ahead through rolling hills covered with summer grass and wildflowers. Despite the circumstances of their departure, Margaret felt a sense of liberation as Millbrook disappeared behind them. For 3 years, she had carefully navigated the narrow space between acceptance and suspicion, constantly aware that one misstep could destroy everything she had built. Now that the worst had happened, she discovered an unexpected freedom in no longer having to maintain that precarious balance. How are you holding up? Clayton asked, as they settled into a steady traveling pace. Better than I expected, Margaret replied honestly. I suppose there's relief in finally understanding where I stand, rather than constantly wondering when the ground might shift beneath my feet. Clayton nodded thoughtfully. I've found that certainty, even when it's unwelcome, is often easier to deal with than uncertainty. At least now you know what you're facing. As they rode through the morning heat, Clayton began telling Margaret more about his ranch and the people who worked there. The Broken Wheel Ranch covered nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, supporting several hundred head of cattle and employing a dozen cowboys year-round. Clayton had built the operation from nothing following the war, using skills learned during his cavalry service and a determination to create something permanent in a land that seemed to resist stability. The thing about ranch life, Clayton explained, is that it strips away pretense pretty quickly. Out there, what matters is competence, loyalty, and the ability to handle whatever challenges arise. People's backgrounds become less important than their present contributions. Margaret understood that he was describing a community quite different from Millbrook, where social acceptability often mattered more than practical effectiveness. The idea of being valued primarily for her abilities rather than her adherence to conventional expectations was appealing, though she also recognized that frontier ranch life would present its own unique challenges. Tell me about Thomas Brennan, Margaret said, refocusing on the patient who had originally brought Clayton to seek her help. Clayton's expression grew serious as he described his ranch hand's deteriorating condition. Thomas had been experiencing increasingly severe episodes of what physicians called soldier's heart, or nervous exhaustion, but which Margaret recognized as symptoms of deep psychological trauma. The nightmares, physical tremors, and inability To maintain normal eating patterns, suggested that Thomas's experiences during the Indian Wars had created wounds that conventional medicine couldn't address. "The thing that bothers me most," Clayton continued, "is seeing a good man slowly destroying himself because nobody knows how to help him heal from what he's seen and done. Tom's got 20 years of productive life ahead of him if we can find a way to quiet the ghosts that are haunting him." Margaret found herself intrigued by the challenge Thomas represented. She had successfully treated similar conditions using combinations of herbal remedies that supported nervous system function, along with careful attention to the emotional aspects of trauma. Her grandmother had taught her that some wounds existed in the boundary between body and spirit, requiring treatments that addressed both physical symptoms and deeper sources of suffering. "I'll need to spend time with Thomas before determining what approaches might be helpful," Margaret said. "These conditions often require building trust before effective treatment becomes possible." As the day progressed, and they covered mile after mile of Texas countryside, Margaret felt herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced since arriving in Millbrook. The constant vigilance required to maintain her position in a suspicious community was gradually giving way to a sense of possibility and adventure. Whatever challenges awaited at the Broken Wheel Ranch, they would at least be honest challenges, rather than the hidden dangers of community politics and social expectation. Clayton proved to be an excellent traveling companion, knowledgeable about the landscape they were crossing and comfortable with the silences that naturally arose during long hours in the saddle. Margaret appreciated his lack of intrusive questions about her past or dramatic expressions of sympathy about her current circumstances. He seemed to understand that some experiences were best processed privately rather than analyzed through conversation. By late afternoon, they had covered nearly 30 miles and were approaching the boundaries of Clayton's ranch. The landscape had gradually shifted from the cultivated farmland around Millbrook to wilder country where cattle grazed among scattered oak trees and rocky outcroppings. Margaret could see why Clayton had chosen this location for his operation. The land offered good grass, reliable water sources, and natural barriers that would help contain livestock. "Welcome to the Broken Wheel," Clayton said, as they crested a ridge that revealed the ranch headquarters spread below them. "It's not much to look at, but it's honest country that rewards honest work." Margaret surveyed the collection of buildings that comprised Clayton's ranch with growing appreciation. The main house was a substantial structure built from local stone and timber, designed for function rather than show, but clearly constructed by someone who understood both craftsmanship and the demands of frontier living. Outbuildings included a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for the cowboys, and various smaller structures that suggested a well-organized and self-sufficient operation. As they rode down toward the ranch headquarters, Margaret noticed several men working with horses in the main corral. Their movements had the easy competence of experienced cowboys, but she also observed that they were watching the approaching riders with alert curiosity. News of strangers traveled quickly in isolated communities, and Margaret understood that her arrival would be the subject of considerable speculation among Clayton's men. "Clayton!" called out a weathered man emerging from the barn. "Good to see you back safe. We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost in civilization." Clayton dismounted and helped Margaret down from her horse before making introductions. "Frank, I'd like you to meet Miss Margaret Foster, the healer I went to find. Miss Foster, this is Frank Morrison, my foreman, and the man who keeps this place running when I'm not here." Frank Morrison removed his hat respectfully, revealing grey hair and intelligent eyes that assessed Margaret with frank curiosity. "Pleased to meet you, Mom. Clayton's told us a bit about your reputation for healing. We're hoping you might be able to help Tom Brennan." Margaret appreciated Frank's direct approach and lack of excessive deference. "I'm hoping so as well, Mr. Morrison. Where is Thomas now?" Frank's expression grew troubled. He's been staying in the small cabin behind the bunkhouse. Keeps mostly to himself these days. The boys try to include him in activities, but he seems more comfortable alone. Been getting worse since Clayton left to find you. Margaret understood that Thomas's isolation was both a symptom of his condition and a potential barrier to treatment. Building trust with someone who had withdrawn from social contact would require patience and careful attention to his comfort level with interaction. "I'd like to see him as soon as possible," Margaret said, "but I'll also need somewhere to set up my medical supplies and prepare treatments." Clayton gestured toward the main house. "You'll be staying in the guest room, and there's a large kitchen where you can work with your medicines. We'll make sure you have everything you need." As Margaret gathered her belongings and followed Clayton toward the house, she felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the circumstances that had brought her here. For the first time in months, she was approaching a medical challenge, without having to worry about community politics or social acceptability. Her success or failure would be measured by Thomas Brennan's recovery rather than by adherence to conventional expectations. The evening air carried the scents of sage and cattle, along with the sounds of men finishing their daily work. Margaret realized that she was entering a world where her abilities would be valued for their practical effectiveness rather than judged against abstract standards of propriety. It was a liberating thought that filled her with renewed confidence in her calling as a healer. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the support of people who understood the value of competence and the importance of helping those in need. The accusations and fears that had driven her from Millbrook seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant compared to the real work of healing that awaited her at the Broken Wheel Ranch. Margaret's first encounter with Thomas Brennan came at dawn on her second day at the Broken Wheel Ranch, when she found him sitting alone by the creek that ran behind the main buildings. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, though his haunted eyes and prematurely grey hair made him appear older. His hands trembled slightly as he attempted to drink coffee from a tin cup, and Margaret could see the careful way he positioned himself to observe all approaches while maintaining an escape route behind him. "Mr. Brennan," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Margaret Foster. Clayton brought me here to see if I might be able to help with your condition." Thomas looked up at her with the wary assessment of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from well-meaning offers of assistance. "Another doctor, I suppose. Well, ma'am, I appreciate Clayton's concern, but I've been poked and prodded by enough physicians to know there's nothing they can do for what ails me." Margaret approached slowly, noting how Thomas's muscles tensed despite his outwardly calm demeanor. "I'm not exactly a doctor in the conventional sense, Mr. Brennan. I'm what some people call an herb woman, and I specialize in conditions that traditional medicine often finds difficult to address." Something in her tone seemed to catch Thomas's attention. "Herb woman? You mean like those old Mexican curanderas who work with plants and such?" "Similar principles," Margaret acknowledged, settling herself on a nearby rock at a respectful distance. "I was trained by my grandmother, who understood that healing sometimes requires addressing the spirit as well as the body." Thomas studied her face with new interest. "Clayton mentioned something about you having troubles with townspeople who didn't appreciate your methods. Said they accused you of witchcraft." Margaret was surprised by his directness, but appreciated his lack of pretense. "That's correct. Some people find it easier to blame supernatural forces than to acknowledge that women might possess effective healing knowledge." "Well," Thomas said with the first hint of humor she had seen from him, "I reckon if you're witch enough to help with my particular brand of trouble, I might not mind a little supernatural assistance." Over the following days, Margaret began to understand the full scope of Thomas's condition and the remarkable man hidden beneath his suffering. Through careful conversation and observation, she learned that he had served as a cavalry scout during the Apache conflicts, experiencing combat situations that would have broken many men completely. His nightmares weren't random fears, but specific memories of violence and death that his mind couldn't process or release. What amazed Margaret most was discovering the depth of Thomas's knowledge about the natural world. His scouting experience had required him to learn desert survival skills, plant identification, and weather prediction that rivaled her own botanical understanding. As they walked the ranch boundaries together, Thomas pointed out medicinal plants she hadn't recognized and shared water-finding techniques that demonstrated intimate familiarity with the land. "You know," Margaret said during one of their walks, "your knowledge of plants and natural healing might be part of your recovery rather than separate from it. Sometimes reconnecting with life-giving knowledge helps balance memories of death and destruction." Thomas paused beside a stand of wild sage, running his fingers through the aromatic leaves. "Never thought of it that way. During the war, plants were just things that might conceal enemies or provide water. Didn't occur to me they could be allies instead of neutral territory." Margaret began incorporating Thomas's natural knowledge into his treatment, asking him to help her gather and prepare herbal remedies. The work gave him purpose beyond his own healing, while gradually rebuilding his connection to the natural world. As a source of life rather than danger, she watched his hands grow steadier as he learned to harvest plants at their peak potency, and his sleep improve as evening preparations of valerian and passion flower began to quiet his nightmares. The transformation in Thomas caught the attention of the entire ranch community. Frank Morrison mentioned to Margaret that Thomas had begun participating in communal meals again and had even offered to help train younger cowboys in tracking and survival skills. Clayton observed that Thomas's hypervigilance was gradually giving way to normal alertness, and his conversation was becoming more connected to present circumstances rather than past traumas. But Margaret's most significant revelation came not from treating Thomas, but from discovering the true scope of Clayton Hartwell's influence and reputation throughout Texas. The revelation began with the arrival of an unexpected visitor on her 10th day at the ranch. Dr. Samuel Richardson rode up to the Broken Wheel Ranch in a fancy buggy that looked distinctly out of place among the working horses and practical vehicles of the ranch. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, impeccably dressed and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to deference and respect. "I'm looking for Clayton Hartwell," Dr. Richardson announced to Frank Morrison. "I have urgent business to discuss with him regarding a medical matter of considerable importance." Clayton emerged from the barn where he had been working with a difficult horse, his expression showing surprise at the visitor's appearance. "Dr. Richardson, what brings you all the way out here from Austin?" "Clayton, I've traveled here specifically to speak with Miss Margaret Foster," Dr. Richardson replied, his tone carrying an urgency that immediately put Margaret on alert. "I understand she's currently residing at your ranch." Margaret stepped forward from where she had been preparing medicines on the kitchen porch. "I'm Margaret Foster. How can I help you, Dr. Richardson?" The distinguished physician studied her with frank curiosity before speaking. "Miss Foster, I'm here representing the Texas Medical Association and several prominent physicians throughout the state. We've been following reports of your work with great interest." Margaret felt her stomach tighten, wondering if the accusations from Millbrook had somehow reached official medical authorities. "What kind of reports, Doctor?" "Reports of remarkable healing results using botanical methods that conventional medicine has been unable to duplicate," Dr. Richardson replied, surprising her completely. "We've documented cases where patients who failed to respond to standard treatments experienced significant improvement under your care." Clayton moved closer to Margaret, his expression showing as much surprise as her own. "Dr. Richardson, exactly how extensive have these reports been?" The physician opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several sheets of documentation. We've been tracking Miss Foster's work for nearly 2 years, Mr. Hartwell. Military physicians at frontier posts have reported success rates with certain conditions that exceed anything achieved through conventional treatment. Prominent ranchers have written testimonials about Miss Foster's effectiveness in treating both humans and livestock ailments. Even some members of the state legislature have requested information about her methods. Margaret stared at Dr. Richardson in amazement. "You've been monitoring my practice. How? Why?" "Miss Foster, the medical establishment is not as closed-minded as many people believe," Dr. Richardson explained. "We're always interested in effective treatments, regardless of their origin. When multiple sources began reporting consistent success with your botanical preparations, we initiated a discreet investigation." Clayton's expression had shifted from surprise to something approaching amusement. "Dr. Richardson, am I correct in understanding that while the citizens of Millbrook were accusing Miss Foster of witchcraft, the medical establishment was actually studying her methods with approval?" "That's precisely correct, Mr. Hartwell. In fact, the incident in Millbrook has accelerated our timeline for making this offer." Dr. Richardson turned back to Margaret. "Miss Foster, the Texas Medical Association would like to invite you to participate in a formal study of botanical medicine. We're prepared to offer you official recognition, legal protection, and funding to document your methods for broader medical education." Margaret felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet once again, but this time in an entirely positive direction. Official recognition? What would that involve? Dr. Richardson smiled for the first time since his arrival. "It would involve formal acknowledgement of your expertise in botanical medicine, legal status that would protect you from future accusations of practicing without credentials, and most importantly, the opportunity to teach your methods to other medical practitioners." The irony was overwhelming. While Millbrook's citizens had been burning her herbs and accusing her of supernatural practices, the state's medical establishment had been documenting her success rates and preparing to offer her official recognition. The knowledge that had made her suspect in a small community was considered valuable enough by educated physicians to warrant formal study and preservation. Clayton shook his head in apparent amazement. "So Margaret's been running from accusations of being too successful when she should have been receiving recognition for being exactly that successful. Unfortunately, Mr. Hartwell, rural communities often respond to unfamiliar expertise with suspicion rather than appreciation," Dr. Richardson observed. "That's precisely why we believe Miss Foster's knowledge needs to be preserved and disseminated through proper medical channels." Margaret found herself thinking about her grandmother's warnings that healing women often faced persecution for their effectiveness. "Dr. Richardson, this opportunity sounds extraordinary, but I have to ask, what guarantees would I have that this recognition wouldn't be withdrawn if political attitudes change?" The physician nodded approvingly at her caution. "An excellent question, Miss Foster. The documentation we've compiled creates a legal foundation that would be difficult to challenge. Additionally, several prominent physicians have already begun incorporating your methods into their own practices with remarkable results. Your knowledge has become too valuable to suppress." Thomas Brennan approached the group, his improvement over the past week evident in his steady gait and alert but relaxed demeanor. "Begging your pardon, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you saying that Miss Foster's treatments are being recognized by official medical authorities?" Dr. Richardson studied Thomas with professional interest, clearly noting the transformation. In someone he probably would have classified as a hopeless case of nervous exhaustion. "Mr. Brennan, I assume Miss Foster's reports on your condition have been particularly noteworthy. Your recovery has been documented as evidence of botanical medicine's effectiveness with trauma-related disorders." Thomas looked at Margaret with gratitude and amazement. "You've been writing reports about my treatment? I document all my cases," Margaret explained. "It's essential for understanding which treatments work best for different conditions. I had no idea those records were being reviewed by medical authorities." Clayton stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Dr. Richardson, assuming Margaret accepts this opportunity, what would it mean for her immediate circumstances? She's currently facing accusations in Millbrook that could result in legal difficulties." "Those accusations would become irrelevant," Dr. Richardson assured them. "Official recognition from the Texas Medical Association would supersede any local charges. In fact, we're prepared to issue a formal statement defending Miss Foster's practices and condemning the persecution she's experienced." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as she contemplated the dramatic reversal of her circumstances. Less than 2 weeks ago, she had been fleeing accusations of witchcraft that could have resulted in imprisonment or worse. Now she was being offered official recognition and legal protection for the same knowledge and skills that had made her suspect. "Dr. Richardson," she said carefully, "I'm deeply honored by this opportunity, but I need to understand exactly what would be expected of me. I've built my practice on treating individual patients according to their specific needs. I wouldn't want to compromise that approach for bureaucratic convenience." The physician smiled broadly. "Miss Foster, that individualized approach is precisely what we hope to learn from you. Modern medicine has become increasingly standardized, sometimes at the expense of attention to individual variation. Your methods demonstrate the value of personalized treatment that we believe could improve medical care throughout the state." Frank Morrison, who had been listening to this conversation, with growing amazement, spoke up. "If you don't mind me asking, Dr. Richardson, how did you know to find Miss Foster here at the Broken Wheel?" Dr. Richardson glanced at Clayton with an expression that suggested shared knowledge. "Mr. Morrison, Clayton Hartwell has been providing us with information about Miss Foster's work for some time. We asked him to locate her and ensure her safety while we prepared this formal offer." Margaret turned to Clayton with surprise and growing understanding. "You've been working with medical authorities. That's why you knew about my reputation extending beyond Millbrook." Clayton's weathered face showed a mixture of pride and slight. "Embarrassment, Margaret. I should have told you sooner. I'm not just a rancher. I served as a medical officer during the war, and I've maintained connections with physicians throughout Texas. When reports of your work began circulating, I was asked to investigate and provide protection if necessary." The revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of everything that had happened since Clayton's arrival at her cottage, his immediate recognition of her abilities, his knowledge of her reputation, his confident intervention during the confrontation with Constable Hughes. All of it made sense now. "You were protecting me even before the accusations in Millbrook escalated," Margaret realized. "The medical community has been concerned about persecution of effective healers," Clayton confirmed. "We've seen too many talented practitioners driven away or silenced by ignorance and superstition. You were too valuable to lose to mob hysteria." Thomas Brennan laughed, the sound carrying genuine humor that Margaret hadn't heard from him before. "So Miss Foster's been saved by the very medical establishment that small-town folks think she's threatening. That's about the finest irony I've encountered in quite some time." Dr. Richardson gathered his papers, preparing to conclude his visit. "Miss Foster, I don't need an immediate answer, but I hope you'll consider our offer seriously. The opportunity to legitimize and preserve your knowledge could benefit countless patients throughout Texas." Margaret looked around at the ranch that had become her refuge, at Thomas, whose recovery demonstrated the effectiveness of her methods, at Clayton, whose revelation had transformed her understanding of her own situation. 2 weeks ago, her life had seemed to be crumbling around her. Now she was being offered opportunities she had never imagined possible. Dr. Richardson, I'm certainly interested in discussing this further, she said. But I'd like to complete Thomas's treatment and consider all the implications before making a final decision. Of course, the physician replied. Take all the time you need. Meanwhile, please know that you have the full support and protection of some very influential people who value your contributions to healing. As Dr. Richardson departed in his fancy buggy, Margaret sat down heavily on the porch steps, overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her circumstances. Clayton settled beside her, his presence offering the steady comfort she had come to rely on during their brief but intense acquaintance. "Are you angry that I didn't tell you about my medical connections sooner?" Clayton asked quietly. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I should be, but somehow I'm not. Everything you did was aimed at protecting me and preserving my ability to heal people. How can I be angry about that?" Thomas approached them, his improvement now so evident that it seemed to radiate from his entire being. "Miss Foster, if you do accept this opportunity with the Medical Association, what would happen to patients like me who need the kind of treatment you provide?" "Thomas, the whole point would be to train other practitioners in these methods," Margaret explained. "Instead of one herb woman working in isolation, there could be dozens of healers throughout Texas using botanical medicine to help people with conditions like yours." Clayton nodded thoughtfully. "And instead of hiding from accusations of witchcraft, you'd be teaching at medical schools and publishing in scientific journals." Margaret stood up, decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Dr. Richardson is right. This knowledge is too valuable to remain hidden or to be lost because of ignorance and fear. If I have the opportunity to legitimize botanical medicine and protect other healers from persecution, I have an obligation to take it." As the sun set over the Broken Wheel Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Margaret realized that her greatest trial had become her greatest opportunity. The accusations that had driven her from Millbrook had led her to recognition and protection she never could have achieved through conventional channels. Her grandmother's knowledge, passed down through generations of healing women, was finally going to receive the respect and preservation it deserved. And Margaret Foster, once branded as a witch for her healing herbs, was about to become a pioneer in the official recognition of botanical medicine in Texas. 3 weeks after Dr. Richardson's visit, Margaret was documenting Thomas Brennan's remarkable recovery when a cloud of dust on the southern horizon announced the arrival of multiple riders approaching the Broken Wheel Ranch at considerable speed. Clayton emerged from the barn where he had been shoeing horses, his expression immediately shifting to alert concern as he counted the approaching figures. 8 riders, he announced to Margaret and Thomas, who were working in the herb garden she had established behind the main house. Coming hard from the direction of Millbrook. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread, though she tried to maintain composure. "Constable Hughes?" Clayton shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun, studying the distant riders with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "Hughes is there, along with several men I don't recognize. They're armed and riding like they mean business." Thomas Brennan straightened from where he had been carefully harvesting feverfew, his recovery evident in the fluid way he moved and the steady alertness that had replaced his previous hypervigilance. "Want me to gather the boys?" he asked Clayton, referring to the ranch hands who were scattered across the property, attending to various duties. "Not yet," Clayton replied, though his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "Let's see what they want before we escalate the situation. But get word to Frank that we might need backup." As the riders drew closer, Margaret could see that this was indeed Constable Hughes, leading what appeared to be an official posse, complete with rifles and the grim determination of men convinced they were pursuing dangerous criminals. Behind, Hughes rode Jeremiah Polk and several other men from Millbrook, along with strangers whose official bearings suggested they represented territorial or even federal authority. "Miss Foster," Clayton said quietly, "I want you to stay near the house and let me handle this initial confrontation. These men are clearly here with serious intentions, and I'd prefer to understand their purpose before you become directly involved." Margaret appreciated Clayton's protective instincts, but she also understood that hiding would only validate whatever accusations had brought this posse to the ranch. "Clayton, if they're here for me, avoiding confrontation won't solve anything. I'd rather face whatever charges they're bringing with dignity than be dragged out of hiding like a criminal." The riders reined in at the ranch's main gate, their horses lathered with sweat from the hard ride. Constable Hughes dismounted first, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he was about to achieve long-sought justice. "Clayton Hartwell," Hughes called out, his voice carrying across the ranch yard, "we're here on official business regarding the fugitive Margaret Foster. We have warrants for her arrest on charges of practicing witchcraft, endangering children, and fleeing lawful custody." Clayton stepped forward, positioning himself between the posse and the house where Margaret stood on the porch. "Constable Hughes, this is private property, and you're a considerable distance from your jurisdiction. What authority do you claim for serving warrants on my ranch?" A distinguished man in his 50s dismounted beside Hughes, his clothing and bearing suggesting significant official authority. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Federal Marshal Daniel Westbrook. These charges have been elevated to territorial jurisdiction due to allegations that Miss Foster has been practicing medicine without proper credentials across multiple counties." Margaret felt the familiar cold fear that had driven her from Millbrook, but now it was mixed with anger at the persistence of accusations that had already been discredited by higher authorities. She stepped forward, determined to face these charges directly rather than allow others to fight her battles. "Marshal Westbrook," she called out, descending the porch steps despite Clayton's protective gesture. "I'm Margaret Foster. What specific charges are you here to enforce?" The federal marshal studied her with professional assessment, his expression suggesting he was evaluating her demeanor and credibility. "Miss Foster, you're accused of practicing medicine without proper licensing, endangering the lives of children through unauthorized treatment, and fleeing lawful custody to avoid prosecution." Before Margaret could respond, Clayton stepped forward with a confidence that suggested he was prepared for exactly this confrontation. "Marshal Westbrook, before you proceed with any arrests, I think you should review some recent documentation that bears directly on these charges." Clayton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew an official-looking document, which he handed to the federal marshal. "This is a formal statement from the Texas Medical Association, officially recognizing Miss Foster's expertise in botanical medicine and condemning the persecution she has faced." Marshal Westbrook unfolded the document, his expression shifting from stern authority to growing surprise as he read. Margaret could see Constable Hughes's confidence wavering as the marshal's demeanor changed from certainty to confusion. "This document appears to be genuine," Marshal Westbrook said slowly, "and it's signed by some very prominent physicians. It states that Miss Foster's methods have been under official medical review for 2 years and have been found to be both effective and properly grounded in established botanical knowledge." Jeremiah Polk spurred his horse closer to the group. "Marshal, that document doesn't change the fact that this woman fled lawful custody and has been practicing medicine without proper credentials. Whatever political connection she might have developed since then doesn't alter her criminal behavior." At that moment, the sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone's attention to the ranch's main road, where a fancy carriage was approaching, followed by several riders on horseback. Margaret recognized Dr. Richardson's distinctive buggy, but the escort suggested that this was a more official visit than his previous consultation. The carriage drew up beside the posse, and Dr. Richardson emerged along with two other distinguished gentlemen whom Margaret didn't recognize. The authority radiating from these newcomers was immediately apparent, causing even Federal Marshal Westbrook to straighten his posture and adjust his hat respectfully. "Gentlemen," Dr. Richardson announced, approaching the group with obvious confidence, "I'm Dr. Samuel Richardson, representing the Texas Medical Association. This is Dr. Harrison Cole from the University of Texas, and Judge William Patterson from the Austin District Court." Judge Patterson, a distinguished man with silver hair and penetrating eyes, stepped forward to address Marshal Westbrook directly. "Marshal, I understand you're here to arrest Miss Foster on charges related to her medical practice." "Yes, Your Honor," Westbrook replied, though his confidence was clearly shaken by the unexpected arrival of such prominent officials. "We have warrants from Millbrook charging her with various crimes related to unauthorized medical practice." Judge Patterson examined the warrants Hughes had provided, his expression growing increasingly stern as he read. "Marshal Westbrook, these charges appear to be based on local prejudice rather than legitimate legal violations. Miss Foster has been under observation by medical authorities for 2 years, and her work has been found to be both legal and exemplary." Constable Hughes stepped forward, his frustration evident. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this woman has been practicing witchcraft under the guise of medicine. She's deceived good Christian people and endangered children with her supernatural practices." Dr. Harrison Cole, who'd been observing the confrontation with academic interest, spoke for the first time. "Constable Hughes, I've personally reviewed Miss Foster's treatment methods and documentation. There's nothing supernatural about her work. She's simply applying botanical knowledge that has been recognized by medical authorities for centuries." Margaret watched this extraordinary scene with amazement, hardly able to believe that such prominent officials had traveled to defend her against accusations that had seemed insurmountable just weeks ago. The transformation of her circumstances felt almost surreal. Clayton moved closer to Margaret, his expression showing a mixture of pride and protective satisfaction. "This is what real authority looks like," he said quietly. "Not mob justice and local prejudice, but educated evaluation by people who understand the difference between competence and witchcraft." Judge Patterson turned to address Margaret directly. "Miss Foster, the state of Texas formally apologizes for the persecution you've endured. The charges against you are hereby dismissed, and you're under the official protection of territorial authorities." The effect on the posse was immediate and dramatic. Several of the men from Millbrook looked at each other with obvious uncertainty, realizing that their mission had not only failed, but had potentially put them in conflict with legitimate authority. Even Constable Hughes seemed to deflate as he understood that his accusations had been officially rejected by people with far more power than his local position provided. "Furthermore," Judge Patterson continued, "any future harassment of Miss Foster will be considered interference with an officially recognized medical practitioner and will be prosecuted accordingly." Dr. Richardson approached Margaret with documents in hand. "Miss Foster, if you're still willing to accept our offer, I have the formal paperwork establishing your position as a consultant to the Texas Medical Association. Your legal status will be beyond question, and you'll have official support for your practice throughout the state." Margaret accepted the documents with hands that trembled slightly from emotion rather than fear. The papers represented not just legal protection but validation of everything her grandmother had taught her about the healing power of plants and the importance of women's knowledge in medical practice. "Dr. Richardson," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming nature of the moment, "I'm honored to accept this position. If my knowledge can help train other practitioners and protect patients who need botanical treatments, then I'm committed to this work." Thomas Brennan stepped forward, his transformation over the past month serving as living proof of Margaret's effectiveness. "Gentlemen, if you need evidence of Miss Foster's healing abilities, I'm happy to provide it. A month ago, I was barely functional due to what doctors called nervous exhaustion. Today, I'm healthier than I've been in years." Dr. Cole examined Thomas with obvious professional interest. "Mr. Brennan, would you be willing to be interviewed about your treatment and recovery? Your case could provide valuable documentation for our research into botanical medicine's effectiveness with trauma-related conditions." "Gladly, sir," Thomas replied. "If my experience can help other veterans who are suffering from similar conditions, I'd consider it an honor to contribute to that effort." Marshal Westbrook formally returned his warrants to Constable Hughes, his expression suggesting professional embarrassment at having been involved in pursuing unfounded charges. "Constable, these warrants are invalid. Miss Foster is under official protection, and any future legal actions against her would need to be approved by territorial authorities." Constable Hughes accepted the returned documents with obvious reluctance, but the presence of such powerful officials left him no room for argument. "Marshal, what about the concerns of the citizens of Millbrook? Are we supposed to ignore their fears about supernatural practices?" Judge Patterson fixed Hughes with a stern gaze. "Constable, those fears are based on ignorance and prejudice rather than legitimate concerns. Education, not persecution, is the appropriate response to misunderstanding about medical practices." Dr. Richardson turned to address the assembled group. "Gentlemen, this incident illustrates exactly why we need better education about botanical medicine. Miss Foster's knowledge could benefit communities throughout Texas, but only if people understand that effective healing is science, not superstition." As the confrontation concluded and the various officials prepared to depart, Margaret found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 3 months ago, she had been a solitary healer practicing on the margins of a suspicious community. Now she was officially recognized as a medical expert with the protection and support of the state's most prominent authorities. Clayton approached her as the crowd dispersed, his expression showing deep satisfaction at the outcome. "Miss Foster, or should I say Dr. Foster, how does it feel to have your grandmother's knowledge officially recognized by the medical establishment?" Margaret smiled, touching the silver locket containing her grandmother's picture. "I think she would be amazed, but pleased. She always believed that healing knowledge belonged to the people who needed it, not just to those with official credentials." Judge Patterson lingered as the others prepared to leave, approaching Margaret with additional documentation. "Miss Foster, there's one more matter we need to address. The state of Texas would like to offer you compensation for the persecution you've endured and the property you lost when you were forced to flee Millbrook." Margaret examined the financial documents with surprise. The compensation was substantial enough to allow her to establish a proper medical practice anywhere in Texas, complete with facilities for training other practitioners in botanical medicine. "Judge Patterson, this is incredibly generous. But I should mention that I've found a place here at the Broken Wheel Ranch where I can continue my work effectively." The judge glanced at Clayton with obvious understanding. "Miss Foster, we're prepared to support your practice wherever you choose to establish it. If Mr. Hartwell's ranch provides the environment you need for your work, we're happy to accommodate." That arrangement, as the official parties departed, leaving Margaret, Clayton, and Thomas standing in the ranch yard surrounded by the debris of a confrontation that had transformed into vindication, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle that had begun with her grandmother's teaching had culminated in official recognition and protection that would ensure the survival and growth of botanical medicine in Texas. "Clayton," she said, turning to face the man who had protected her when protection was most needed, I have a question that's not related to medical practice or official recognition." Clayton smiled, understanding the direction of her thoughts. "What question is that, Margaret? Would a former cavalry officer turned rancher turned medical consultant be interested in partnering with an officially recognized herb woman in both professional and personal endeavors?" Clayton's weathered face lit up with genuine joy. "Margaret Foster, I thought you'd never ask. I've been hoping for exactly that partnership since the day I first met you." Thomas Brennan laughed, the sound carrying the pure happiness of someone who had rediscovered his connection to life. "Well, this has been quite a day for transformations. Miss Foster becomes an official doctor, I become a functioning human being again, and Clayton finally gets the courage to propose to the woman who's been healing everyone around her." As the sun set over the Broken Wheel Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Margaret realized that her greatest trials had indeed led to her greatest opportunities. The accusations that had driven her from Millbrook had brought her to recognition, protection, love, and the chance to ensure that her grandmother's healing knowledge would survive and flourish for generations to come. The woman who had been branded a witch for her healing herbs had become an angel of mercy in the eyes of those who truly understood the value of compassion, knowledge, and the courage to stand by one's principles against any opposition. 2 years after the dramatic confrontation that had transformed Margaret Foster from accused witch to recognized medical pioneer, the Broken Wheel Ranch had become something unprecedented in Texas history, the first official training center for botanical medicine in the American Southwest. What had begun as a desperate refuge for a persecuted healer had evolved into an institution that attracted students, physicians, and researchers from across the region. Margaret stood in the morning light outside the newly constructed medical training center, a substantial building that housed classrooms, laboratories, and dormitories for visiting students. The structure represented the physical manifestation of her grandmother's wildest dreams, a place where traditional healing knowledge could be studied, preserved, and passed on to future generations with the full support of official medical authorities. The transformation had not been without challenges. Converting a working cattle ranch into a medical training facility while maintaining its agricultural operations had required careful planning and significant investment. But the support from the Texas Medical Association, combined with funding from wealthy benefactors who had benefited from Margaret's treatments, had made possible what would have been impossible for a lone herb woman to achieve. Clayton emerged from the main house, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression of a man who had found his perfect partnership in both work and life. Their marriage, 6 months after the official vindication, had been celebrated throughout the medical community as a union that combined practical frontier wisdom with academic medical knowledge. The Austin delegation should arrive by noon, Clayton informed her, settling beside Margaret on the bench they had placed to overlook the training center. "Dr. Richardson mentioned they're particularly interested in your new research on treating battlefield trauma with botanical preparations." Margaret smiled as she thought about the work that had grown from Thomas Brennan's remarkable recovery. What had begun as treatment for one damaged veteran had evolved into a comprehensive program that was helping hundreds of men throughout Texas deal with the psychological wounds of war and frontier conflict. Thomas should be back from San Antonio this morning, Margaret replied. "The Veterans Hospital there has agreed to implement our trauma treatment protocols on a trial basis. If the results match what we've achieved here, it could revolutionize how military medicine approaches psychological injuries." The mention of Thomas brought a warmth to Margaret's heart that went beyond professional pride. His transformation, from broken, haunted survivor to confident healer and teacher, represented everything she hoped to achieve through her work. Thomas had not only recovered completely, but had become one of her most effective instructors, particularly skilled at helping other veterans understand that healing was possible. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main road, where a familiar figure was indeed returning from his latest consultation in San Antonio. Thomas Brennan rode with the easy confidence of a man completely at peace with himself and his purpose, his saddlebags bulging with notes and materials from his successful mission to expand their treatment methods to military facilities. "Thomas," Margaret called out, waving him toward the training center. "How did the demonstrations go?" Thomas dismounted with fluid grace, his bearing showing no trace of the trembling, haunted man who had once sat by the creek, unable to hold a coffee cup. "Steady. Better than we hoped, Margaret. The army surgeons were skeptical at first, but when they saw the results with their most difficult cases, they became believers quickly enough." He secured his horse and joined them on the bench, his enthusiasm for the work evident in every gesture. "Dr. Martinez asked me to tell you that they want to send a dozen medical officers here for full training in our methods. Seems the army is finally ready to acknowledge that some wounds require different healing approaches." Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction that came from seeing her knowledge reach people who desperately needed it. The expansion of their trauma treatment program to military facilities represented a victory not just for botanical medicine, but for all the veterans who had been dismissed as weak or cowardly when they struggled with invisible wounds. "Any word from the university delegation?" Thomas asked, settling in to share the details of his San Antonio visit. Clayton nodded toward the horizon, where dust clouds indicated multiple approaching vehicles. "Looks like they're arriving right on schedule. Dr. Harrison Cole is bringing representatives from medical schools in Austin, Houston, and even New Orleans. Word of our success has spread further than any of us anticipated." The arrival of the university delegation marked another milestone in Margaret's journey from persecuted outcast to recognized pioneer. These distinguished academics were coming to study her methods not as curiosities, but as legitimate medical techniques worthy of inclusion in formal curricula. As the carriages and riders approached the ranch, Margaret reflected on how dramatically the landscape of medical education was changing. 2 years ago, the idea that universities would send delegations to learn from an herb woman would have been laughable. Now, her training center was being recognized as innovative and essential to the future of frontier medicine. Dr. Harrison Cole, whom Margaret now considered both colleague and friend, emerged from the lead carriage with obvious enthusiasm. Behind him came professors, medical students, and researchers whose presence validated the academic legitimacy of everything she had built at the Broken Wheel Ranch. "Margaret!" Dr. Cole called out, approaching with the familiarity of someone who had become a regular visitor. "I brought some colleagues who are very eager to see your latest developments in botanical pharmacy and trauma treatment." Margaret rose to greet the delegation, conscious of how natural it now felt to be addressed as an equal by the medical establishment that had once seemed impossibly distant and exclusive. The transformation in her own confidence mirrored the broader changes in how botanical medicine was being perceived throughout Texas. "Dr. Cole, welcome back to the Broken Wheel," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the training center. "We've made significant progress since your last visit, particularly in developing standardized preparation methods that maintain the effectiveness of traditional remedies while meeting modern pharmaceutical standards." As the delegation toured the facilities, Margaret took pride in showing them the laboratories where plant medicines were prepared according to rigorous standards, the classrooms where students learned both traditional knowledge and modern scientific methods, and the clinical areas where patients received treatment under careful supervision. The visitors were particularly impressed by the patient success rates documented in Margaret's meticulously maintained records. The combination of traditional Healing wisdom with modern documentation methods had created a body of evidence that even the most skeptical physicians found difficult to dismiss. "Miss Foster," observed Dr. Patricia Manning, one of the few female physicians in the delegation, "your approach to integrating traditional knowledge with modern medical standards could serve as a model for institutions throughout the country. Have you considered publishing your methods in national medical journals?" Margaret exchanged glances with Clayton, knowing this question touched on opportunities they had been discussing privately. "Dr. Manning, we've been approached by several publishers, but we want to ensure that any publications serve the goal of improving patient care rather than simply advancing academic careers." The afternoon was spent in detailed discussions about research methodologies, treatment protocols, and the possibility of establishing similar training centers in other states. Margaret found herself at the center of conversations that would have been unimaginable during her days of isolation and suspicion in Millbrook. As evening approached and the delegation prepared for dinner at the ranch house, Margaret took a moment to walk through her expanded medicinal garden. The original small plot behind her cottage in Millbrook had grown into acres of carefully cultivated healing plants, representing both native Texas species and varieties she had introduced from other regions. Thomas joined her among the neat rows of herbs, his presence a constant reminder of the personal transformations that made all the institutional recognition meaningful. "Margaret, do you ever wonder what your grandmother would think about all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the training center and the collection of distinguished visitors. Margaret touched the silver locket she still wore, containing her grandmother's picture. "I think she would be amazed by the scale, but pleased by the purpose. She always believed that healing, knowledge belonged to everyone who needed it, not just to those born into families that preserved it." "Speaking of preserving knowledge," Thomas said, producing a letter from his pocket, "this arrived while you were with the delegation. It's from a group of Cherokee healers in Indian Territory. They want to exchange knowledge about plant medicines and treatment methods." Margaret accepted the letter with growing excitement. The possibility of learning from Native American healing traditions while sharing her own knowledge represented exactly the kind of cross-cultural medical exchange that could benefit everyone involved. "Thomas, this could be extraordinary. Imagine combining Cherokee plant knowledge with our documented treatment methods and modern preparation standards. We could develop healing approaches that neither tradition could achieve alone." As they returned to the ranch house for dinner, Margaret was struck by the evening's peaceful atmosphere. The sounds of conversation and laughter from the medical visitors mixed with the familiar ranch sounds of cattle settling for the night and cowboys finishing their daily work. The integration of medical education with working ranch life had created a unique environment that seemed to benefit both enterprises. Clayton met them at the porch, his expression showing the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his perfect role in supporting Margaret's vision while maintaining his own identity as a rancher and former military officer. "The university people are impressed," he reported. "Dr. Cole thinks we're ready for formal accreditation as a medical training institution." Dinner that evening resembled a medical conference more than a ranch meal, with discussions ranging from pharmaceutical chemistry to the psychological aspects of trauma treatment. Margaret found herself moderating conversations between academics who brought theoretical knowledge and practitioners who offered hard-won experience. Dr. Manning raised her wineglass in a toast that captured the spirit of the gathering. To Margaret Foster, who proved that wisdom doesn't require credentials, that effectiveness matters more than convention, and that sometimes the best medical advances come from the most unexpected sources. As the evening concluded and the visitors retired to their accommodations in the training center, Margaret and Clayton walked hand in hand through the ranch grounds, taking in the physical evidence of how completely their lives had been transformed. "Clayton," Margaret said, stopping to look back at the lights in the training center windows, "do you ever regret that your simple cattle ranch has become a medical institution?" Clayton laughed, the sound carrying the contentment of a man who had found purpose beyond his original dreams. "Margaret, this ranch was never simple, and you've made it something more important than I ever imagined possible. Besides, we still run cattle. We just happen to train doctors between roundups." The next morning brought news that would expand Margaret's influence beyond anything she had previously contemplated. A telegram arrived from Washington, D.C., inviting her to testify before a congressional committee investigating medical practices on frontier military installations. "They want me to speak to Congress?" Margaret asked, reading the telegram with amazement. "About botanical medicine and trauma treatment?" Thomas, who was preparing for another consultation trip, this time to establish a satellite program in Houston, grinned at her surprise. "Margaret, you've become the leading authority on frontier botanical medicine in the United States. Of course, Congress wants to hear from you." Dr. Richardson, who had stayed overnight to continue discussions about expanding the training program, nodded emphatically. "Margaret, your work here has achieved something remarkable. You've taken traditional healing knowledge and given it scientific credibility while maintaining its essential effectiveness. That combination is exactly what frontier medicine needs." As Margaret considered the invitation to address Congress, she realized that her journey from accused witch to national medical authority represented more than personal vindication. It symbolized a broader recognition that effective healing could come from sources outside conventional medical establishments, and that wisdom often resided in traditions that formal education had overlooked. 6 months later, Margaret stood before a committee of United States senators and representatives in Washington, D.C., speaking about the importance of preserving and integrating traditional healing knowledge with modern medical practice. Her testimony led to federal funding for botanical medicine research and the establishment of training programs at military installations throughout the frontier. The woman who had once fled accusations of witchcraft in a small Texas town had become an advisor to the highest levels of American government on matters of medical policy and frontier health care. Her grandmother's knowledge, passed down through generations of healing women, was now influencing decisions that would affect thousands of patients across the expanding nation. Back at the Broken Wheel Ranch, Margaret continued her work with the same dedication that had driven her since her grandmother's first lessons in the healing power of plants. The training center graduated dozens of practitioners each year, spreading botanical medicine knowledge throughout the Southwest and beyond. Thomas Brennan had established satellite programs in 6 states, helping veterans and trauma survivors find healing through methods that conventional medicine was only beginning to understand. Margaret's marriage to Clayton had produced not only personal happiness, but a partnership that demonstrated how different types of knowledge and experience could combine to achieve results neither could accomplish alone. Their ranch had become a symbol of what was possible when practical wisdom met institutional support, when traditional knowledge gained modern legitimacy. As Margaret stood in her garden on a peaceful evening, surrounded by the plants that had been both her salvation and her path to recognition, she understood that her story was larger than personal triumph. It represented the validation of countless women throughout history whose healing knowledge had been dismissed, suppressed, or condemned as supernatural. The herbs growing around her were the same species her grandmother had taught her to cultivate, but they now grew in soil that had been enriched by recognition, protected by law, and supported by institutions that ensured their benefits would reach everyone who needed them. Margaret Foster, once branded a witch for her healing herbs, had become what Clayton had always known she was, an angel of mercy whose knowledge, courage, and compassion had transformed not just individual lives, but the entire landscape of American medicine. Her legacy would continue growing, like the plants in her garden, spreading healing wherever it was planted with care, wisdom, and love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.